Hello, I'm Dennis Ross. I've had a long association with United Against Nuclear Iran, and I'm really pleased to be able to moderate a discussion today with Senators Bob Menendez and Senator Lindsey Graham. These are two senators who don't need an introduction to this particular audience. As all of you know, they have had a long involvement in history with national security and foreign policy, and both of them have also focused for a long time on Iran, the nature of the Iranian threat, not only in the nuclear area, but also what Iran has done in the region. I'm especially pleased to do this because having been a political appointee of two Republican presidents and two Democratic presidents, something that makes me a bit of an extinct species, I feel really privileged to be able to conduct a discussion that is really a bipartisan discussion on Iran, which should be a bipartisan issue. I understand that both senators will make brief opening remarks, and then we'll get into a discussion. So Senator Menendez, why don't you kick us off?
Well, let me thank you, Ambassador Ross, for moderating the discussion, for your service to our country. Let me thank UANI for their advocacy. As you probably know, I've focused a good deal of my attention over the past 30 years in Congress working on bipartisan, meaningful initiatives aimed at stopping Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, as well as its other malign activities throughout the Middle East and the world that threatens the United States' interests and partners. And as this audience probably knows, I was not supportive of the JCPOA when it came into effect. At that time, I believed that many of the constraints on Iran's nuclear program were not sufficient. And I also believe we needed to address Iran's ballistic missile program specifically and its other dangerous activities across the Middle East, including support for terrorist organizations and proxies more broadly, along with the nuclear program. However, I also believe that the way that President Trump withdrew from the agreement with no diplomatic path forward for restraints on Iran's nuclear program was dangerous, and we would ultimately lead to embolden Iran. And unfortunately, that's exactly the situation in which we find ourselves today. Following that unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA, Iran began ramping up its nuclear advancements in new and dangerous ways. Unfortunately, the United States was operating relatively isolated from critical European and P5+1 partners in a pressure campaign that failed to yield the results we all wanted. So while I have been cautiously supportive of the Biden administration's efforts to revamp multilateral diplomacy to bring Iran back to the negotiating table, I have been absolutely clear that a return to the JCPOA is not, as it is not sufficient, and that we must work on a concerted diplomatic effort with our allies and partners for maximum impact. I've heard senior members of this administration affirm that their goal is to find a longer and stronger agreement, but I haven't heard a full explanation of exactly what that looks like. But I believe that will be critical for a number of reasons. The first is from a purely practical point of view. At this point, Iran has moved so far out of compliance from the terms of the JCPOA and of the provisions of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231 that we've already passed the expiration of the UN arms embargo. Second, I believe fundamentally that we must have a bipartisan political support for a sustainable, negotiated deal with the Iranians and the international community. And I believe in order to do that, we have to look beyond the scope of the original terms of the deal. I fundamentally reject the paradigm that some push, that if you're not for the JCPOA, then you must be for war. I believe there is more room to think more broadly about a diplomatic path forward. Senator Graham, who I'm honored to join, is my friend, a colleague, and I have come forward with what we think is a pathway forward. And it's a testament to the fact that bipartisan support in Congress for a more comprehensive diplomatic approach is still there. We led a letter to the administration expressing this with more than 40 of our Senate colleagues. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing from my distinguished colleague as well.
Well, thank you, Bob. So for a long time, we've been trying to figure out what to do with the Iranian nuclear ambitions. And I'm in the camp. I don't mind Iran having a civilian nuclear power program for peaceful purposes. It's good for the environment, and I'm a fan of nuclear power. Like everybody listening, I don't want the Iranians to get the capability to build a bomb because I think they'll use it. The Ayatollah to me is somebody you wouldn't want to let have a nuclear bomb. If you're Israel, you can't bet your life on it. So we're trying to find a diplomatic end state. And I've always believed the French position should not have been so easily abandoned. The French said to the Iranians early on, build your power plant, we'll help you build it. We'll do all the reprocessing in France. We'll provide you with all the spent fuel you need to run a reactor. You don't have to enrich. Well, the UAE has done the 1-2-3 agreement. There are about 15 nuclear nations who don't enrich but have nuclear power programs. So what Bob and I have done is basically taken the French idea and broadened it. We're proposing to the world, really, that the Iranians can have nuclear power, the Arab states, the Sunni Arab nations who want nuclear power, let all of them have nuclear power, but let's create an international fuel bank, a reliable source of spent fuel for all the region, and make sure that everybody has the spent fuel they need, but nobody enriches. That to me is an end state that will allow Iran what they say they want, peaceful nuclear power, without creating a nuclear arms race. And I just really do believe, after having talked to a lot of the Arabs in this region, that they would go along with it, as do our friends in Israel. I hope Israel would consider this an acceptable end state, nuclear power without enrichment. They asked me, well, what about Israel? The Iranians have never claimed they wanted to build a bomb, number one. Number two, they never claimed they wanted a nuclear power program to counter Israel. So if they change the game here, it tells you all you need to know. So I do believe that what Bob and I have come up with allows the Iranians and the region to have nuclear power, but nobody can enrich. Nobody needs to enrich. If you want nuclear power, you don't have to enrich. We'll see what the market is here and throughout Europe, but I would give a lot if the administration and our European allies would make this offer to Iran and the Arabs.
Look, I very much appreciate the joint proposal that you've outlined. It has the virtue, as you said, of pretty much taking the whole issue of nuclear proliferation out of the Middle East. The only question, I think, is not whether it's a desirable end state. The question is, can we get there? What I hear you suggesting is you would like the administration to try to mobilize support diplomatically to see if this is something that could be pursued. If that's kind of the first step, what would you say if the administration comes back and says, look, we made this kind of effort in the past. Others outside the region, at least in Europe, are unlikely to support it. We just don't think that this is going to work. If that's the kind of response, how, from your standpoint, how would you prefer to proceed?
Bob?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, I would say you're wrong, and here's why. This is not a U.S.-Iran bilateral proposal. This is not a P1+5 bilateral proposal. This is a multilateral proposal. And so Iran would not be singled out as the country that cannot enrich. On the contrary, we would create a regional fuel bank that all the countries who say that they seek nuclear power for domestic energy consumption and isotopes for medical research would ultimately be able to achieve that, but they would not enrich, which of course gives them their pathway for the potential of a nuclear bomb. It decouples the US-Iran or P5+1 Iran reality. It brings into concert the Gulf countries, which Iran might view as one of their biggest set of adversaries. And it diffuses for everyone, Iran as well as the Gulf countries, a nuclear arms race. We think that that is different. Whenever we have approached Iran, it has been simply about Iran doing this. When you bring the universal partners along, it creates a security paradigm for Iran and for the Gulf countries that ultimately might be more appealing. And if after saying, particularly if Gulf countries sign on to the proposition and Iran does not, Well, after saying that you wanted domestic energy simply for, nuclear energy for domestic energy consumptions, and now you have that opportunity, and your sovereign right to enrich isn't necessarily foregone, but you've delegated it to the IAEA or some other nuclear fuel bank, then when you fail to join the initiative, I think it shows the world and our partners where Iran is really at. So hopefully they would join, in which case we'd stop a nuclear arms race in a part of the world that is a tinderbox, or they would show themselves for what they really are, a country that wants nuclear power, not for domestic energy consumption, but to create a process for a bomb.
You know, what I find interesting about this is you're picking up on a theme that the Iranians have always tried to emphasize themselves. They have said they're being singled out. Somehow they're being treated differently than anybody else. Your proposal is quite the contrary. Your proposal is one that says everybody's in the same boat. You have an absolute right to civil nuclear power. What you don't have a right to is to turn that civil nuclear power into a nuclear weapon. Have you had discussions with the administration on this, and what kind of reaction have you gotten?
Lindsey, welcome to join and jump in. I have had conversations with the administration and with members of the administration, and I think that they wonder whether Iran has not rejected the concept before. And my advocacy within has been, well, they may have rejected the concept that they cannot have nuclear energy or that they have a sovereign right to enrich, but they have never had the opportunity that we are offering in the way in which we're offering, which is a bigger umbrella of security for them and for the region. And so I think it's an open question, especially as Iran has shown its reticence even to come back to the table. They're talking about late November. They're running the clock. I think the IAEA, and we had here the head of the IAEA not too long ago in the Senate, basically made it clear that their time frame of enrichment, the window is, on the verge of closing in terms of passing that pathway. We know what their ballistic missile program already is, and that's already a huge challenge. And so the third element of this is whether or not they have the weaponization developed. And if we cannot get information that the IA has been looking for in several sites that have been publicly reported that the Iranians have resisted giving them information, then I'm not sure we can fully calibrate where their weaponization elements are. So I think this may be a pathway forward for the administration and, the Europeans. With Senator Graham has spoken to several of them. I'll let him talk about that himself, as well as some of our Gulf allies, to say, hey, wait a minute, we have a different paradigm here and a different opportunity to get Iran to consider.
Well, this, Brian, this goes back all the way to the Trump administration. I think the criticism for the Trump administration that's valid to me the most is that what was the end game? You withdrew from the JCPOA, which I didn't like, but so what is an acceptable end state? I've always looked at it that way. Okay, what could we all live with? The region having access to nuclear power, but nobody enriched, seems to be a good end state for the world and the region. Now, we all know the history of the nuclear program in Iran is counter to actually wanting a peaceful nuclear power program. They've done a lot of nefarious things, but they've never been given this opportunity. And our proposal is pretty bold. Now, Bob has gone down the road less traveled for my Democratic colleagues, starting with the JCPOA vote and staying engaged. What am I willing to do as a Republican? I'm willing to work with the administration and all of our allies to basically give some sanction relief to Iran if they'll come back to the table and negotiate an end state as we're discussing, relieving some of the primary sanctions for a specified period of time, see if we can negotiate an end state to entice them to come back to the table. Because I believe the following: longer and stronger won't work. That the Arabs are never going to feel comfortable with an enrichment capability that they don't have, but the Iranians possess. That Israel will never believe that the IAEA or any other group has the capability to stop a breakout. And once you allow the Iranians to go down the enrichment road, you're headed toward a nuclear arms race or a war. And here's the one thing about this problem: it doesn't solve itself. So if we don't find some way to slow down this march by the Iranians toward a 90% enrichment capability, we're headed toward a military conflict. I don't want a military conflict. I want a chance to provide nuclear power to the region. I appreciate Bob pushing the administration. I push the Trump administration. They would never give me what the end state looked like. Bob and I have come up with an end state, I think, that meets the needs of the Iranians in the region and stops the nuclear arms race. If we can't, longer and stronger won't work for me. I doubt if it works for the region. So what about this idea? I think over time it looks better, because the options are going to be, in my view, a diplomatic end state that everybody can buy into, or a military conflict. So this idea may not have resonance right now, but the closer we get to somebody having to take on the Iranian nuclear program, the better this idea will look.
You know, I find the idea very interesting, not only because it's appealing, just because it does define an end state, but I also think the Iranians have created a justification for raising it. And I don't mean in the traditional sense. I mean in the sense that they themselves seem to want to renegotiate the JCPOA. They're playing a waiting game, but I suspect when they come back to Vienna, they will again insist on a variety of conditions that would require the administration to go beyond what they're obligated to do under the JCPOA in return for getting less from the Iranians. So if the Iranians are coming in and basically saying, we want to renegotiate the JCPOA, it actually puts the administration in a position where they could say, you want to renegotiate, you're walking away from the deal. We have decided that it's better to approach this from the standpoint of respecting your need for the right to enrich, but you're foregoing that right so that you can actually have civil nuclear power and everybody else in the region can have it, which also poses less of a risk to you. You, Iran, in the end, will not be better off if the positions you adopt and the capability you develop triggers other countries in the region feeling they have to have that same capability. So the irony is that actually, because of the Iranians, they're creating an opening for just this kind of an initiative. I've often heard that the administration is looking for a plan B. This could well be the plan B. I guess the question I would ask is whether or not, at the same time you're trying to work with the administration, you have established any contacts with the Europeans to see if there would be some greater openness to this. I have no doubt that there would be great receptivity to it in the region. The question in my mind would be, will the other members of the 5+1, in this case, the British, the French, and the Germans, will they be open to it, or will they make the argument that's been tried and failed? And the Iranians will simply reject it. And we're at a place where the Iranians are moving too quickly, so something needs to be done to stop them.
Well, I've had some discussions, particularly with the French, and you know, and as was suggested, elements of this were an original French proposal. So it's attractive to them insofar as that, you know, they had thought of something like this. We expanded it out by thinking about the entire region instead of just a question of Iran. Of course, the world is shaking at the possibility that Iran may have or will shortly cross the threshold of enrichment that would lead them to the capacity to have the material for a bomb. And so therefore they're trying to arrest that. The problem with that proposition is that, first of all, I think there would be very little sentiment in Congress, even for those who supported the JCPOA, to give more and get less from the Iranians. I cannot imagine that would have a significant amount of support here, number one. Certainly it's not for me. Two, if stronger and longer means anything, it means that not only you return to what was the JCPOA, but you deal with other elements of Iran's nuclear program and the sunset provisions and ballistic missiles and destabilization, right? So that's stronger. So more for less doesn't meet that criteria. And then lastly, I think that, again, that the Europeans would find this attractive, and if they see that there is no other plan B, because the only other plan B, short of having another diplomatic initiative as the one that Senator Graham and I are suggesting, is either a comprehensive multilateral sanction regime that would move quickly, that our allies have not been willing to, but maybe in the face of being told by Iran, we're just not going there, that they would engage in. And that would have to happen rather quickly if you want to actually deter Iran from continuing on the path that they're on. Otherwise, it may not have the ultimate goals that you want. And or you have to think about how else do you stop this program from marching forward? And there are very few options left after that. So I think in that regard, that the timing of this and Iran's posture to date makes it increasingly more attractive, including to our European allies.
Well, let me just follow up, Dennis, with the group I want to focus on. The Europeans are important. We ran the idea conceptually by the French, the German, and the British, and they were intrigued by it because it doesn't single out Iran. It puts everybody in the same boat. It gives them what the Iranians say they want, nuclear power without the capability to build a bomb, which is better for everybody. I want to hear what the Sunni Arab states would say. Bob and I have had meetings, and we'll keep that quiet among ourselves, but I want to hear what the potential adversaries of Iran would say. If the Sunni Arab world would say, sign me up, our friends in Israel would say, that's an end state we can all live with. That's what I'm looking for. So we're going to go to our Arab allies and see what they think about this idea. And we're going to call the question. This has been going on way too long. If the Arabs say no, then it's different for Iran. But if the Arabs say, we want nuclear power, we don't need to enrich, we'll forego, then you'll know exactly what Iran wants or doesn't want. And the sooner we can get to that point, the better for the world.
I do think there's a value in creating that kind of exposure. I also think one of the things that has been frequently underestimated, there's a variety of different ways to put pressure on Iran. Obviously, there's been a focus on economic pressure. I want to get to the issue of military pressure in a minute. But the idea of political pressure has too often been underestimated. The Iranians don't see themselves like North Korea. The ability to isolate them politically is also a price as they measure the price. So one of the values of what you're suggesting is there really is a potential not only to expose, but truly to isolate. And that needs to be part of an integrated strategy that really is, I think, important for the administration to pursue. Now, there is this question, and Senator Menendez, you raised it, and Senator Graham, you actually mentioned it before. The Iranians are on a pathway that is unfortunately seemingly to accelerate their move towards a weapon. And I say that because of two things that they're doing right now. The enrichment to 60%. In the past, enrichment to 60% would have been a red line, would have been a trigger. I mean, it would have been said, if you're enriching to 60%, you're demonstrating unmistakably you want a weapon, because there's no justifiable civilian purpose for enriching to 60%, which is what we've seen the director of the IAEA make very clear. But we also see them producing uranium metal, for which there is also no justifiable civilian purpose. Here are two thresholds the Iranians have crossed, and it's not only indicating a certain direction and a certain intent, it also is suggesting, at least to me, that they've lost their fear, that if they continue down this road, that in fact there will be the use of force against them. So the question I guess I have is there sufficient time to work on the proposal you have, which I agree represents a very interesting alternative, but given what the Iranians are doing, is there sufficient time to work on it if there isn't at the same time more of an effort to reestablish in the Iranian mind and in their calculus that the path they're on is ultimately a very dangerous one for them?
Lindsey, you want to deal with that?
Well, yeah, I just think that if they thought tomorrow there would be a military strike to shut down their nuclear program, they might rethink how to solve this problem. Right now, the whole world is watching them be more provocative. The consequences they're willing to do a lot, I think, to keep this program alive. They're willing to suffer. They don't care a whole lot about their people. But when you get to 60%, like you say, what civilian program needs that? So time is probably not on our side, but we need to do two things to the Iranians. Make real the possibility of a military engagement, which they will lose, and give them an opportunity to have nuclear power without enrichment, and include the Arabs in that situation, and let them choose which way they want to go pretty quickly. Because really, they're going to choose. If they go down this path, Israel's eventually has to do something. This is unsustainable. The Israelis are not going to sit on the sidelines and watch the Iranians have a nuclear capable breakout. So that's the backstop to all this. But, you know, time depends on what they think. If they think they're really in a position to get hit militarily, I think they'll slow down. If they don't think, they'll call our bluff.
Yeah,
Senator
I would
Menendez,
just, I would just simply say, look, there have been actions that have already taken place in Iran at their nuclear facilities. I'm not sure who we can subscribe it to, but the bottom line is they know that their pathway forward is not without consequence. And so at the end of the day, I think they have to already in their mind have to be pretty clear that in the absence of any diplomatic engagement, that there will be a consequence to their program. Of course, the problem with the consequences to their programs is it sets it back, but it doesn't end it. And that's the fundamental challenge of it. But if it gets to the point that any countries within the region feel that it is an existential threat to their existence, I'm sure that they will act. That's why what we seek to do is to flush that out in a way that, one, avoids it, number two, stops a tinderbox of the world from becoming a nuclear arms race, because I think, Ambassador, as you suggested, some of the other countries in the region, if they think Iran's going to get a nuclear weapon, then they're going to achieve it as well under the theory of mutual self-destruction. The problem is there are more Gulf countries that could have nuclear weapons than Iran does. So it has to think about that when it's deciding how to negotiate. And then, the last point is, I think that while the Iranians have seen us lead on sanctions, they have also said, the rest of the world is not. And a multilateralization of that, if they are not coming to the table in good faith and with a real purpose of moving backwards, would have a consequence to them that could have tremendous challenges even for this regime, even for a resistance regime.
what is your expectation of how the Russians and the Chinese might react to this kind of an initiative?
Okay, well, I'll just put a fine point on what Bob was saying. I think we all believe, the Iranians believe, if they ever got a nuclear capability, they're home free. Nobody's going to screw with them, because look at what's happened in North Korea. If you get a nuclear weapon, the regime is in good shape forever. Will they ever want to use it one day? That will be a decision they make. But you got to look at it from the region's point of view, particularly Israel's point of view. You're talking about the Ayatollah with a nuke, who's openly denied the Holocaust. These people have a religious agenda. North Korea doesn't. It's kind of a mafia state. But the fear for the region is that the Ayatollah and his henchmen have a religious agenda for the world that doesn't include most of the people in the region. Would they ever use a nuclear weapon? Would you bet your life that they wouldn't? So I don't think Israel's ever going to put themselves in that box. And I don't think the Sunni Arabs will either. If you could convince the Iranians the regime will do better without a nuclear weapon than they will do with a nuclear weapon, then they won't have one. That means you have to put the regime's survival at stake if they continue to go down this road.
And as to your question, Ambassador, about Russia and China, I would just simply say, look, the Russians could very well be one of the entities that actually does enrichment. They do it,
Yes.
In other parts. There's a country that could become a player. I think the Russians' own interest in terms of security is not to see a nuclear-armed Iran. And if the Gulf countries come together, and Russia comes together, I don't think China wants to be the outlier in this particular issue. China's been looking for footholds in the Gulf region. The last thing it wants it to be, I think, is in an adverse position to a united Gulf region with Russia saying, you know, yeah, we could do that. We could do that enrichment. We could be part of that deal.
I think it's a very fair point on the Chinese. I would just add something. When I was in the Obama administration towards the end of the first year, I was sent to Beijing to talk about Iran. And I basically made the following case. I said, look, the US and China both favor stability in the Middle East. You're the world's biggest importer of oil. The last thing you need is a war in the Middle East that is going to cause a great disruption. The greatest single threat to produce that is Iran moving down a pathway towards a nuclear weapon. You may think the United States can stop the Israelis from acting, but if Israel sees this as an existential threat, they will act regardless of what the American position is. So if you want to head that off, you need to, in a sense, demonstrate to the Israelis you're going to join a posture that makes it clear that this will be prevented. Otherwise, you're going to face the very disruption you don't want. Now, at that time, well, granted, it was 2009, the end of 2009, it's not 2021. At that time, that argument seemed to hold a lot of sway with them. I don't know why it still wouldn't be applicable. They still have the same need. They still need to avoid a big disruption. So I do think that that could be part of the argument. I also think that the irony is this is an area where presumably we actually do have a common interest with them. So maybe this is one of those things that we can use in the overall nature of the relationship. I just want to reinforce one point. I do think the point you made, Senator Graham, and you also made, Senator Menendez, it's true there's no military answer to this program. And yet, if the Iranians proceed on the path they're on, there will be a military response. I'm not convinced that they believe that to be the case today. And so I've actually made a proposal where I think to send a signal to them, I think we should provide the Israelis a massive ordnance penetrator and lease them the B-2 bomber, because that would send a message that they better start thinking more seriously about whether or not there could be a military option. I'm not asking for your reaction to that, but I guess I am asking Senator Menendez, do you think the administration needs to send more signals that makes it clear that if there isn't a diplomatic outcome, the Iranians risk their whole nuclear infrastructure?
I think the administration would be well posited with its allies collectively to send a message that there will be real consequences to Iran if you're not of seriousness of purpose in terms of getting to the final result. And that has many different dimensions to it. And I think the Iranians know the capacity of the United States and our allies in that regard. I think that would send an importantly strong message.
Well, look, I appreciate the time both of you have taken and also the thoughtfulness in which you approach the issue. And I very much support the idea and the resolution that you're pushing. I do think it is a good plan B. Thank you again for taking part in this discussion.
Thank you.